Hey guys, what's going on? Thank you all for taking the time to watch this video. Please hit the like and subscribe button if you haven't already. I want to get into a brief video just to kind of give an overview of the issue of Romans chapter 4. And in this series that I've been doing about faith and works, you see up on the screen, Paul versus James, or Paul and James, because you guys know as well as I do, those of you who have looked into the issue of faith and works and so forth and grace in the Bible, how whenever you bring up James 2, someone's going to bring up Romans 4 and vice versa. And people always bring up the issue, did Paul contradict James? Did Paul agree with James or what? So what I want to do is just I'm going to go back into this passage later. And that's this one here up that you see up. I'm going to make a video later on that gives more detail, but I want to give just kind of a brief overview of what this passage is saying and kind of give my thoughts on it. And you guys can go from there. Please bear in mind, this is an overview, guys, so please do not put comments down below that says, hey, notice how he passed right over this and didn't mention this, or why didn't he talk about this? Yeah, well, guys, that's the idea of an overview, right? So let's be real about it. So looking at this passage here, this is Romans 4 specifically. If you look at the context, though, the top, it's Romans 3:27 leading up through 4:8. Because I believe that kind of grabs more of the context. And you can go back even further than that, of course, because overall, I mean, it's just the book of Romans, so it's going to have a flow to it regardless. But here in chapter 3 and verse 27, Paul having just finished making his point about salvation being, justification through faith, right? Apart from the deeds the deeds of the law, as he said above in verse 21, I believe it is, verses 21 through 26, the apostle Paul makes that point, makes that case, that salvation, justification comes through faith and not through the law. And so in this passage here, we see Paul asking the question, where's boasting? And he basically says straight up, it's excluded. There is no boasting and justification through faith. And why is it excluded? By what law, he says? Is it the law of works that justify, or a law of works? No, it's not some law of works that excludes boasting. Why? Because if you were justified by works simply by keeping commandments or keeping God's commands, then there would be a means of boasting, because you could say, I did these things and therefore this guy, right? But no, there is no boasting. It's excluded not by the law of works or a law of works, but by the law of faith, something in addition to, something apart from works, a law of works. And so therefore he says in verse 28, we conclude that what? A man is justified by faith apart from the deeds of the law. There now he's talking about a specific law of works, the law of Moses, and that's shown by verse 29. Or is he the God of the Jews only? Why would he say that if he's not talking about specifically the law of Moses? Because the law of Moses, which was a law of works, and by design, it was a law specifically for the Jews. And so if justification came through the law or a law of works, like the law of Moses, then God will be the God of the Jews, because it would be the Jews who are justified and not the Gentiles. But Paul makes the point, he's also the God of the Gentiles. So he's justifying Jew and Gentile through faith, something aside from a law of works, faith, a law of faith. And then so Paul makes the question, or follows up with the question, do we then make void the law through faith? In other words, do we just toss out the law? Is the law void now, meaningless through faith? Faith, they're talking about a law of faith, back up in verse 27. And he says no, because why? It confirms the law. The law, if you look back in verse 21, Paul said that the righteousness of God is revealed apart from the law, being witnessed by the law and the prophets. So the law and the prophets said that the righteousness that would be acquired or attained, the righteousness of God would be attained apart from the law. It was separate from the law. So by pointing this out, that Paul's saying that we're justified by a law of faith, not a law of works, he says that confirms what the law says. So it establishes the law. And so now he goes to two individuals that demonstrate that salvation or justification does not come through a law of works like the law of Moses. Because remember, Paul here is writing, the significance of the law of Moses is that he's writing to the saints at Rome. And if you look at Romans 1 and 2, and just the whole book of Romans 9, 10, 11, The saints in Rome were a mixture of Jewish and Gentile Christians. So he's addressing this issue of the law, referencing those Jewish Christians there. And so he's pointing out that justification did not come through keeping a law of works. That was not meant to justify. Look at verse 20 above. And so he goes on to say that Abraham, look at Abraham. He's the father of the nation of Israel, the physical nation. He's the father of that nation. Abraham was justified. How was he justified? Because he was the promises were made to him 430 years before the law came. That's Galatians 3 verse 17. And Abraham died like over 300 years before the law was given. And so Abraham was justified. So he wasn't justified by the law of Moses. And so in verse 2, it says, if Abraham was justified by works, that's not talking about him just simply doing what God says. It's talking about a law of works. Go back to verse 27, law of works. It follows all the way down. If Abraham was justified by works, by keeping a law of works, he has something to boast about, right? But Paul said above, boasting is excluded. And so therefore, he can't boast before God. That's the point. Because God doesn't justify people on the basis of keeping a law of works. He justifies them on the basis of what? Faith. And so he goes, Paul goes on to say what? What does the scripture say? Abraham believed God and was accounted to him for righteousness, something apart from a law of works. That's how Abraham, the father of Israel, was justified. He wasn't justified by keeping the law of Moses. No. And so he goes on to say, to him who works, the wages are not counted as grace, but as debt. That is the man who pursues righteousness through a law of works, like the law of Moses. If he attained righteousness through that, it would be indebted to him, not through grace. But God saves people on the basis of what? Grace, Ephesians 2:8. And so he says, but to him who does not work, that is the man who does not pursue justification through a law of works, like the Jews were trying to do, but believes on him who justifies the ungodly, like Abraham did. His faith is counted as righteousness. Just as David, now he goes to someone who was under the law. Abraham lived way before the law. Now he goes to David, King David. David was under the law, and David describes the blessedness of the man to whom God imputes righteousness. Was it the man who pursued a law of works? No, he said to whom God imputes righteousness apart from works, apart from a law of works like the law of Moses. And so he quotes Psalm 32, blessed are those whose lawless deeds are forgiven. Forgiven. See that? And whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord shall not impute sin. So the blessed man here is not the man who acquired righteousness through a law of works and was given or attained righteousness through an indebtedness, or that God was indebted to him and that he earned it and could boast. No, he acquired righteousness through what? Forgiveness. He acquired righteousness through what? His sins being covered. He acquired righteousness through what? God not imputing his sins to him. That is how man acquired righteousness, not through keeping some law of works. It was something in addition to law. And so the point of this is Israel had to, which was under the covenant God had, that old covenant with Israel was a law of works. Back in verse 27. A law of works, which this whole text here is showing us, is not the means through which justification would come. It will come through a law of faith. Well, guess what? Jesus brought the faith. He brought a law of faith. Look at Galatians 3:23 through 25, Galatians 6:2. And so the point is, you Israelites, the Israelites who were under the law of Moses, that old covenant was a law of works. So in order for them to attain to righteousness, the righteousness of God, the righteousness that God has provided for them, it was not through the law. So they had to come out of that covenant and enter into a new covenant that was a law of faith. Get out of that old law of works, that old covenant, and get into the new covenant, which is a law of faith. And is that covenant in which men would be justified on the grounds of his faith, like Abraham, and the one that David said would be blessed, not the man who is trying to work, or as far as in the sense of attain it through a law of works. Because a law of works does not justify, it just lets man know that he is in sin. That's back in verse 20. So anyways, that's kind of my summary. I'll come back to that later and get more heavily into it, but I guess I appreciate you guys listening to this. If you have any comments, any thoughts on what I had to say here, I'd appreciate it much. Y'all have a good evening. Take care.